Welcome to our webinar session today at Swiss Cyber Institute. My name is Samir Aliyev. I'm a founder and CEO of the Institute. And today we are going to talk about cyber risk quantification, which is hosted by Balbix. Before I introduce the topic, I would like to introduce Balbix is a cybersecurity posture automation company. And Balbix is using AI technologies to reinvent how to world-leading organizations reduce the likelihood and impact of the breaches. And the topic of cyber risk quantification is very important for many businesses. And today you will learn how to successfully operationalize cyber risk quantification within your cybersecurity program and how the cyber risk quantification allows risk to be reported in line with the business needs and improves communications between the security team, senior leaders, and the board. Today, I'm not alone. I have very valuable speakers here. First, I would like to introduce you Mr. Paul Kelly, former Global Head of Cyber Risk at HSBC Bank. He is a transformational leader and a data evangelist with over 20 years of an experience. And then we have Daniel Gisler, who is Group Chief Information Security Officer of Earlycom. And Daniel is a security veteran who is a respected thought leader in the industry in Switzerland. And we have Sid Wahi from Balbix, who is the Director of Product Management. Sid is an accredited with the specialization in risk and financial models and their use in supporting business decisions and strategy. This is an online event. The event is recorded and we will make it available to you after the event. You will receive a follow-up email. Please use chat button or Q&A button to ask your question during the event. We will be very happy to ask your question to the speakers. And the event will take around 1 hour from your valuable time. And the first 45-50 minutes will be presentation discussion between our speakers and the moderator. We sit. And then you are welcome to send us your questions. We will answer all of your questions. Please use Q&A button or chat button. During the presentation, we will also show you some polls, some questions, and please be active. Choose your answer and let us know what you think about the question that you will see in your screen. Sid, stage is yours. Please start your presentation with your valuable speakers, and we will be here to support you. And we welcome everyone to the session right now who is online here and looking forward to hear your questions.
Perfect. Thank you, Samir, and a very good afternoon to everybody and our expert panel, Paul and Danielle. I will be the moderator, as Samir has mentioned, for this session, and a couple of housekeeping points that Samir has already mentioned, but I'll just reiterate. Please do use the Q&A functionality to sort of submit any questions you'd like to ask our expert panel. Also, we'll be launching a series of poll questions for you, which will help us gain an understanding collectively of where we are in our thinking around CRQ, and we'll try and weave some of the results into the conversation today. So, and we'll give you some time to answer these questions. So without any further ado, could we launch our poll questions, please?
Questions are launched. We are looking forward to hear everyone, your questions, answers. I need to launch all the questions one by one, actually. Therefore, first question is launched, and within 30 seconds, I will launch the second question. Unfortunately, I cannot do all of them in one time. So I'm going to stop the first question, then we are going to the second question. Please give us your answers. The second question is launched. Looking forward to hear your response. And within 30 seconds, I will go to the third question. So I see that answers are coming. We have now around 20 answers. Thank you very much for your activity. Now we are going to the third question. Thank you very much. Now third question is online. Looking forward to hear your responses. Now I see very good activity here. Answers are starting to come. We will launch the answers later on during this presentation to you. You will have also an overview on it. So I'm going to close the question within 20 seconds. Please be active. It's interesting to see all the answers is coming here. Very good results. Good. Thank you very much, everyone. We are ending the poll and looking forward to hear our speakers.
Perfect. Thank you, Samir. So could we please launch the results for the first poll, please? Perfect. We asked you, what are the minimum aspects you need in order to report effectively to your board? And unsurprisingly, we've got a sort of a bell curve shape to the responses, where most of the participants are saying quantification is important and it must convey a notion of monetary risk to the board. So with that, could I please open with the first question to our panelists? Paul, Danielle, why is CRQ becoming important?
Daniel, do you want to go first or should I? Me, okay.
You can
why
go.
is CRQ important? So look, fundamentally, we live in a dynamic environment, and I think you've got to look at CRQ in two different ways. So first off, let's just start with understanding our risk in such a way that we can present it to the board so that they understand what we're doing, i.e. in terms of what is the risk exposure that the business has, and then why am I spending money on my cybersecurity controls in order to mitigate our risks, and then what is the effect of me spending money on my cybersecurity controls so I can demonstrate a return on my investment. I think fundamentally that's there. The question then becomes, to a certain extent, and maybe we'll get into this later, which is how do you do it and how often do you do it? Do you do it just once because you're trying to do an annual cycle? So you say, well, I'm going to quantify my risk now, I'm going to go and get some investment, I'm going to use the investment, and then I'm going to show the difference I had last year, and then get going. And I'll probably get into why I don't think that's sufficient these days. But that is at least an initial state where we've got to get a reasonable understanding. And I think the number of times I've sort of been in a position where the boards have turned around and said, are we not done yet? Is a sort of, we need to help people understand that cybersecurity is a dynamic environment and we need to be able to keep on top of it as we go around. But I'll leave it there because I'm sure we'll cover some of these things later on. Daniel, over to you.
Yeah, thank you very much, Paul. I mean, looking from a company perspective, we look at it as a kind of a pretty easy thing in these days, because what is the worst case to happen to a company in these days? It's ransomware. Simple as that. And the impact to a company, if it's hit by ransomware, it's disastrous. So the risk equation is then simple. Risk is then equal impact multiplied by probability. And what is the thing what we can influence is probability at the end. And probability in these days, I think it's very important that we do have a clear picture at any time. So therefore, we can't just do it once a week or a month or something like that. So we need to have some tools, support that show us the probability on a almost near real-time basis. And this is then adding a very positive thing to the equation. If you go back to risk equals impact multiplied by probability. And this is how we're trying to do it from a worst case approach. Let's say as a Maersk case, I call it, everything is black, and then take it from there. So it's rather very easy from an equation viewpoint, but the tricky part starts when you then start implementing this kind of thing.
Yeah, and I think if I was to add to that, I think various regulatory bodies around the globe are starting to require more and more. They're starting to delve into companies, particularly if you're listed on a stock exchange or you're regulated as a financial entity. I mean, the new SEC rules, I think, are quite interesting, where you're going to have to, as part of your annual submission to the SEC, explain who on your board understands cybersecurity for a start, and then secondly, explain how you are assessing your risk. And I think cyber risk quantification comes into that. We've got to be able to assess our risk, and what is the metric that we use as our risk value? Well, most of the time when we talk about risk to businesses, we often talk about what is the financial impact. So therefore, risk quantification from an impact point of view, a dollar point of view or a pound point of view, makes it an important measure in trying to meet those regulatory objectives.
Yeah, and maybe also from again from our side, so we are the lucky ones because our business has defined the core business process, and we can then focus on them directly. So this is then where we get the money from, and the core business process are always supported by IT assets at the end. So therefore, we need to understand what kind of assets these are. This is the one part, and then we also need to understand what kind of asset do support those assets. Then I'm talking about IT infrastructure at the end. If you talk about also the practical part in the field, how this is working, and these two together, so let's say the business critical process equipment plus the critical infrastructure equipment, this is then the focus where we need to make sure that there is everything safe. And again, almost in a real-time thing, we need to understand what is the vulnerability of those assets in terms of software vulnerabilities, but also not only software, but also configuration, let's say, or password, weak passwords and stuff like that. So all these combination we need to look at on a very close part on almost real time. So this is then helping us to actually work against those risks on a daily basis in a live environment.
Well, thank you very much. That's really, really interesting to hear your views. I've got a question from the audience for you now. Is CRQ suitable to all types and sizes of organizations? What would your response be to that?
I would say it has to be in these days. Even from, let's say, as I tried to explain it from the very easy equation part, a ransomware is disastrous for every company. It doesn't matter the size at the end. So therefore, it's important, seen from my perspective.
Yeah, I tend to agree. I think, look, if you look at the world today, where we're moving away from cash, every single business, even storeholders at the local market who are taking your payment through iZettle have some form of cybersecurity risk in their business. How am I going to continue if I'm using computers? How do I do that? The question is, of course, do they need to invest in cyber risk quantification? I would argue that the payment providers do, that's for sure. But they need to have some level of understanding and awareness of cybersecurity of what's going on, and to think about the things that they need to be doing. Now, you can, I guess this is where we get into what sort of cyber risk quantification do we want to do. It's what I would call or I've recently thought about, which is a sort of fair approach or the more detailed approach. And the fair approach I sort of take is the actuary approach, which basically says, what kind of business are you? What kind of controls have you got? How big's your revenue, et cetera, and you work it out using actuary tables to a certain extent to say my risk is this big. Or there's what I describe as the fire risk assessor approach, who comes in and has a decent look at what's actually going on. What are you actually trying to protect? Where are your actual controls? Walking around inside your business and saying, well, hang on a minute, you've got a lit candle next to the curtains. That's quite a problem, and you probably need to do that. And your risk quantification based off of that. And I think to a certain extent, both have value. And if you're a small company, then maybe the former is what you need, because it just gives you an idea. On a larger organization, I think you really need to get into what's going on, and then start to really understand my risk relevant to my business exactly. And I think we need to start thinking along the lines of how do we measure that risk. We too often do it on 4-box grids or 5-box grids. But every day we've got new vulnerabilities, thousands of them potentially in our estate. Every day we're trying to close vulnerabilities, thousands of them in our estate. And we need to understand where we are at any point in time, but also what the threats to us are, and then balance the two to make sure that our remediation is appropriately targeted to the stuff that's really going to hurt us the most. Fundamentally, I don't see it as being that much different from market or credit risk, where we are starting to, a company gives out loans every day and people pay back loans every day. Well, what's my delta? I probably want to know that on a reasonably frequent basis, and I probably want to know the same for my estate on a reasonably frequent basis.
Daniel, any points from you on that Paul just said?
No, it's just perfect.
Oh, perfect. And to be honest, Paul, I can echo that. I am an actuary, and I have had the experience of implementing diverse kinds of models. So I completely get your point around the fair approach and it being more aligned to the actuarial way of looking at things. Yeah, and I love the analogy around the lit candles near the curtain and trying to understand truly inside-out perspectives. Yeah, cool. It's a good time to sort of actually bring in our second poll results. And we've got another question from the audience, but we'll share the results first. And we asked the question, what are the factors hindering you on your CRQ efforts? And it's quite an interesting set of results. We've got too much data and difficulty to build insights, and inability to find adequate data sets. So it's like conflicting views of the attendees today. And obviously, a lot of them are also saying they don't know how to calculate the risk. So I guess with that, then, Paul, Daniel, if someone were to come to you and ask you, how do I get started with CRQ? What are the typical challenges or barriers against organizations embracing CRQ? And how you overcome them? What would you sort of say to these people?
May I start, Paul?
Of course.
Yeah, simple. Know your garden with each single asset. So, and this is where it all starts. So the tricky part is really to get an asset overview that you can then judge what actually do you have in your, I call it garden, let's say, and then you can act. Without having that one, you are always in a kind of gray zone. You don't know what is out there and so on. So therefore, you can't protect them. That's a simple start, and this is the most tricky one. I always raise the question to my colleagues: do you know how many assets you have connected to your network? And then you see already the question mark in their eyes. So not a lot of people actually do know that. Everything starts with inventory and understanding.
Yeah, I totally agree. Yeah, how many people see MDB as a mess? Right, and let's just start there. Right, you fix your CMDB or fix your asset inventory. You've got to have. There are means of doing it. Balbix has got a way to do it, which allows you to take the digital exhaust of the tools that are in your environment and build yourself a full hardware and software bill of materials. That's got to be the starting point, because from there you can then understand, well, what are my hardware and software vulnerabilities? I can look at then you have to sort of answer, how are these all strung together so that I can find my configuration vulnerabilities and password vulnerabilities and other bits and pieces that are in there. And then how well, if you've done that, if you've done your full hardware and software bill of materials, you start to get to, well, how well are my cyber secures penetrated into my environment? I've bought CrowdStrike, fantastic. Have I put it on all my servers? I don't know. How do I know? Is the agent of the right age? There are multiple factors that you need to build up, but I think Daniel's absolutely right. The first starting point is to understand, what have I got? Because there's no point in building a wonderful CRQ or building a wonderful cybersecurity capability and forgetting all the servers that you've got in your estate that are just not connected to CMDB. and you just happen to not be able to see them for whatever reason. How many people, well, here's another one, just to answer that question. How many people have gone around the data center, identified all the servers that they thought they had, and then there's some extra ones?
I mean, maybe in addition to that one, I'm not so worried about the known ones. So everything which is managed in an antivirus tool or whatever, that's I'm not so worried about those. I'm worried about the unknowns, and this is bothering me. And as long as you don't have anything which brings or surfaces the unknowns, then you have a problem.
Definitely.
And what would you say to our attendees who said there's either too much data or too little data to help sort of start with the quantification? How should they sort of address, let's say, the mountains of data versus no data?
So, shall I again?
Yeah, go for it. Sorry, I was ready, but yeah, it's fine.
I mean, this is a great question, Sita. I mean, this is where I struggled from the very beginning. I usually get overwhelmed. If implementing a new tool or whatever, a vulnerability management tool, you just get thousands of vulnerabilities. So you really get overwhelmed. And if I get overwhelmed as a CISO, I can imagine how the people who need to do the work will get overwhelmed. There's no chance to work on that one. And if you every day see a red thing somewhere, you get used to it, you don't take care of it anymore. So therefore, this is really important that there's something which helps you to prioritize these things based on the criticality of an asset, based on the exposure of that asset because of vulnerabilities, misconfiguration, password exposure, and stuff like that. So this is the only way that a tool helps you to identify the priority one assets to be fixed at. That's the only way to go. Otherwise, you will kill the people. And then the other very important part is also that you not only show the whole part to the whole team worldwide, seen from our perspective, with more than 180 locations, we need to make sure that we can focus on the specific things for the people locally, which in their area where they are responsible for. They don't care about location one in overseas. They care about their location. But the sum, if everyone looks at it on their location, it will have a positive impact overall. So therefore, it's also important to have a clear focus for the teams working on those things.
Yeah, I agree. I think that if you're suffering from too much data, then you just need to go through what is the data that I need, and have I got that data? Then how am I going to use that data? How am I going to pass all that data up and present it? It's sort of linked to how do I do the risk quantification, which is what Daniel's talking about in terms of being able to prioritize assets. Yeah, and there are different ways of doing that. I'm sure you can talk about how Balbix does that, but mine to attack is a good way of thinking about things, which is, so if I can start with knowing all of the things that I have, secondly, knowing all the vulnerabilities that affect the things that I have and the security controls that I've got in place, then you can start to plot things through a MITRE attack. But what you need to do is have some really clever data scientists, or go and buy somebody who's already done it, to try and build that cyber risk capability, because you are talking about dealing with, let's face it, petabytes of data if you're quite a big organization. So you need to have the capability to manage that data, use that data, and to deliver you those actionable insights through a dashboard that makes sense.
Perfect. Thank you. And just to sort of echo, I think, like you both said, I think that's the way sort of Balbix sort of approaches its risk quantification. It's a unified risk model that's based on a golden source of truth. So as Daniel and Paul have mentioned, we do sort of create that first complete hardware and software bill of materials, and we infer the vulnerabilities on that to do the quantification. We believe that's the right way, and it's all real time and automated. So to answer the question for the attendees who said, how do you do it? That's probably the process sequentially. You identify what you can, you infer the risk on that, and then you quantify it. Perfect.
And I think sorry, I was going to go on to say there are steps beyond it, which is, the other answer to that is go and invest in some really good data management, data engineering, data scientists, right? Because then you can you can join stuff up, and I think this might be going into where we're going next with. So if you can go beyond cyber, you can start to think about tech risk, and if you can link your assets to your business processes, and then for the sake of argument, add in perhaps a mean time between failure table, you could start to model what's the likelihood of my business process failing just due to tech risk. It's not too different from how do we model aeroplanes when bits of components break. But you need data scientists.
Yes, the amount of data we have now available, you're right, it's become a data science problem as much as cybersecurity technical problem. One question that I have sort of found when I've spoken to a lot of customers is, how do I get monetary numbers from a CRQ exercise that everybody believes in? Any thoughts, gentlemen, and how you bring everybody around the table to agree with the quantification, the numbers that come out of your quantification?
Yeah, cool. I think that what's interesting in this is nothing is really that accurate, right? Because we are talking about risk, and we are talking about things that are variable. So I think you just have to get to a point where it seems sensible. And I think if you're getting to, so this comes back really to what we were talking about earlier about the frequency of assessment. If you're able to do real-time calculation of what's going on in your environment, then it's going to fluctuate, isn't it? And I think what's more important is not necessarily the actual number, albeit it needs to be in the right ballpark, but is the historical trend, right? Is it trending in the right direction? Are we doing the right things that are affecting the shape of this curve? And I think that's the piece that gets to be really interesting. And are we going to a point where I think we're at a comfortable level? And then so if you first start on your CRQ journey and you've assessed everything, you found all your components, you found all things, you assessed it, and you go, crikey, we've got a risk exposure of this high amount. I think that's probably quite shocking to most people to start with, but let's go there and say, well, how much did Maersk lose? And it's quite a large number. I don't think they've ever disclosed the full amount, but I imagine it's several zeros. You go, well, here are all our things that are wrong, and that's why we're exposed to this. Then this is what we're going to do. And is that curve coming down? And then again, you get to the sort of, okay, now we're at a comfortable level. We feel that that's a level of safety that we're okay with. Is that reasonable? And I guess over time, you just have to look at what's happening and is that where you want to be? And I think it's the shape of the curve and the trends. And of course, new threats, new vulnerabilities, you can get spikes and you can measure how quickly it takes you to fix. But does that feel about right? It's never going to be perfect.
I mean, Paul, you mentioned the journey. It is really a journey. You never know where you start from the very beginning, as long as you don't have the overview of all your assets, so where to start. So once you have the transparency, then the journey starts, and then you walk along that journey and grow along the journey. And this is exactly what you said, Paul. It's about the trend at the end, or let's say call it in the very beginning. So how we do it, so we are still on that journey, we are improving. But what we also can use from the very beginning, we talk about mean time to patch. How long does it take from resolving these kind of things? So once the patch is out, how long do we get, or how long does it take to get us these things patched? And also based on the priorities and stuff like that, things we have talked about. And this is the thing what everybody understands. So how long does the time take? And the smaller you get, the better you are. And this is what we are working on. And the journey then adds piece by piece at the end. And we hope we will get to a place or to a point where we can then also put in the Swiss francs behind an asset. We're not quite there yet, but we are working towards that one. So with the help of Balbix.
Yeah, and I think if you took it a step further and said, if I want to understand the risk associated with my supply chain and I ask my vendors to do CRQ, I don't think you're going to go and ask them what's the height of the curve, what exposure they've got. What you really want to understand is what's the shape of their curve and what's the trend of it. And actually what's really interesting then is if you overlaid those trends and everybody gets a spike at the same time, you go, well, hang on a minute, we've got some systemic risk in our supply chain and we might want to diversify. You could think about that in terms of a regulator looking at a particular sector as well is another opportunity for that. So, but you would, in those particular cases, I think you would have an anonymized y-axis of the actual dollar value or Swiss franc value, but you would definitely want to understand the shapes of those curves.
That's a really interesting thing. Thank you. I think this is a good time to introduce the results of our third poll. So we asked you regarding risk quantification, how do you characterize the need for automation? And I think, as you can see on the screen, most of the participants have said automation is important to a certain extent. But surprisingly, 14% still see no need for automation at the moment. So I think one question that I'd like to pose to our panelists is, when we talk about CRQ, we've touched on this, Paul and Daniel, a little bit, is around the FAIR methodology and the FAIR approach to doing things. And a lot of people, I suspect, who are doing it in the first bucket here, who see no need for automation, are probably doing it maybe once a year or at a point in time exercise, possibly leveraging the FAIR methodology. How appropriate do you think is the FAIR methodology given the current dynamic nature of cyber risk?
Sorry, say that again. I missed you. Sorry.
No, so no worries. So I think the third poll question was around automation, and we found that about 14% of our current attendees do not see the need for automation. And then how does that sort of play into, when we talk about CRQ, we talk about FAIR as, it's been synonymous with FAIR for a while, but how appropriate is FAIR as a construct and a methodology in the current environment, given the dynamic nature of CRQ? Nature of cyber risk.
So I think the issue here is, and it's probably something that we haven't really talked about, but we've talked about understanding your assets, and what we haven't talked about is understanding the dynamic nature of the threat. And in your risk assessment, you have to bring in that threat intelligence as well. And so there is an element of how good am I, but actually, are there live exploits in the wild? Am I being targeted? Because that changes the nature of your risk as well. And the question is, if you're doing the FAIR methodology, which you might sit there, filling out my questionnaire, going to my actuary tables, is that giving you the active insight to be able to deal with known threats that are seeing you? Probably not. But you may well have another activity where you're using threat intelligence to try and inform. I think if you want to get to automation, and automation certainly makes sense for massive estates that are being well managed, and there are platforms out there like ServiceNow that's going to start helping you automate your patching process, etc., etc. But you still want to prioritize that activity. So having a platform that says, I'm going to combine live threat information with my live environment to automatically ticket in, based on those priorities, to automatically change and dynamically change those priorities to meet my goals. I need to keep an eye on it, but I think that just really helps, right? Because you're starting to get ahead of the game and you're identifying the pinch points that you're really exposed to and going for them first. And it is really exposed to, and I think that we probably haven't spoken enough about this, the need for that threat intelligence in your cyber risk quantification model. Because without it, it's sort of, it's an academic exercise. It's like, are you being targeted? Because that makes a difference. Is my sector being targeted? Are my supply chain being targeted? Are they, what's on the dark web? What's telling me, what's building? Are there live exploits for some of these vulnerabilities? Are they loose in the wild? These are questions that have to help inform your prioritization. And I think a really good CRQ model helps you do that prioritization by taking those things into account.
Sid, I would like to pick up the initial question about is automation required or a need? I would say it's a must in these days because there's so many information around it. I mean, Paul, you mentioned it, it's peta and even more data, and there's no human being who can manage all these kind of things. Because at the end, we need to make decisions based on a lot of data. And if you don't have anything which helps you to do that, you are lost in these days. And then it's just a kind of best guessing in a box. You mentioned it, 3, 2, 3, or whatever kind of box, top right, top left, whatever, doesn't matter at the end. It has to be in real time in these days. So times are over where we can put in these boxes and cross somewhere. So it's really have to be real time, almost real time, and it's dynamic. Today, what was good might be tomorrow a very weak point, and you need to understand that. You need to know that, and then you can act. If you don't know that, you're lost. So therefore, I 100% support that statement. It's a must in these days, and we have the capabilities in these days. There are tools around which help us, but we need to make use of it.
Yeah, just to add to that, there's a little bit of science there that humans can probably manage about 5 variables to optimize 1 KPI. And I think we've got quite a few KPIs in cybersecurity, and I also think we have more than 5 variables. So yeah, I think Daniel's right.
Thank you both. One question that we often get is around people who say CRQ is not that important because I'd rather run my program focusing on security controls. And what I wanted to ask you is, what are your thoughts about the dangers of over-reliance just on security controls as a way of managing your risk?
I mean, that's a tricky question, Sid. So, I mean, depending in which area you're in or industries and how regulated you are, so you have to deal with a lot of controls. And we also, let's say, get these kind of questions from customers from various sources and so on. So about all these controls where we need to fill it in, so with hours and stuff like that. But sometimes if I see these questionnaires or control set, I quite often ask myself, well, is this still helping us in that way? Of course, it has to be as a certain framework and stuff like that, not to argue on that one, but do we really focus on the right thing at the end? Why do we still get a lot of companies are breached on a daily basis? They run into ransomware. Have we done everything correct in the past? I'm also looking at awareness part. So now a little bit open up the window. So how about awareness? Have you done the right thing and in the past? And if, why does it still happen that much that companies go down? And are these controls, let's say, asked by whatever auditors, customers, whatever? Is this really the right questions they have raised in the past? So we may need to rethink that potentially as well, because there's still a lot of companies that are going down. They just have a check mark somewhere in a book. Well, we have done it, but that doesn't say anything. So I have been in a meeting with a CEO. They had ransomware and a ransomware attack. They were, let's say, standing in front of their grave, so to say, as a company, in standing in front of the grave. And he said, actually, well, we have done an ISO certification half year before that attack, and we passed it, and then everybody felt happy. But is that the truth? I don't know. I'm not questioning about the frameworks. I'm just questioning maybe how do we, let's say, implement those things.
I think, and just to echo that, I think it is going back to the fundamental question we started at the beginning. What about the stuff you don't know?
Yep.
And how are you surfacing that? Maybe it's possible, but I think there are always some unknowns out there that just because of the way we develop IT, most IT development, we have quite a lack of rigor in many cases, I think. Now, maybe that's different in that particular company, and they have got it all sewn up. That might be possible, but I still go down to the what do you not know, and how are you trying to find out that you don't know? People rely on, oh yeah, I've got all of my authenticated scans. Well, what about the servers you can't put the agent on? How do you know about them? What are you doing?
I mean, also to add here, so we were right now talking about the cybersecurity framework from NIST about the identify and protect, let's say, domain, so-called. And if it goes south, so if something unknown gets hit, then of course we also need to have the detect part, that we also are capable to detect these things if something goes wrong. Beside all the things you think you have more or less under control or not, the detect part is then playing a very important part as well. So this then shapes it in a perfect picture at the end. So identify, protect, detect, these are the essential ones. And if all these three doesn't help, then you need to be prepared for the recover part as well, which hopefully never ever comes into the game.
Nice, thank you. So I guess a question I've got from the audience is to you individually, what does a successful CRQ program look like? What is success in a CRQ program for you? How would you characterize success?
Okay.
Go ahead, Daniel.
Okay, good. Sorry again first. Well, that's a very good question. The success, I mean, again, worst case is ransomware. So what we do in these kind of things, so we do kind of penetration test. I don't care that much if I have a check mark here or there or whatever, this control is implemented and so on. So that's important to understand what is in there somehow. But the effectiveness, it doesn't say anything about that if you just have a check mark. So we do, let's say, penetration testing, regular penetration testing with internal penetration tests, where we have, let's say, a pen tester sitting on our machine and then let them walk. How many vulnerabilities do they find? Do they are able to laterally move? Then we are at the point where Paul also was talking about the MITRE ATT&CK frameworks. All these kind of things will then be tested. And this is actually then a kind of a statement. If an adversary or a pen tester has problem to move laterally in an environment, this is then a kind of a, I call it successing, underlying the trend what we see based on, let's say, mean time to patch. Because in one of our last penetration tests, there was a quite nice statement from the penetration test. We didn't find vulnerabilities. At least on the systems we have tested. So not saying that we don't have vulnerabilities. But this is how we kind of try to measure it, if you call it success. So this is certainly giving you some confidence level that you are on the right track, never ever saying that this is perfect. But the way, the journey might not be that bad. So call it that way.
Yeah, for me, a successful CRQ. A successful CRQ is one that helps give me insight into the environment that I'm managing. So I've got what I would call real-time sort of situational awareness of what's going on. So first off, that's really valuable. What do I actually know about my security posture, and how well can I do that? And then it's one that allows me, ideally, if we can automate, and it's one that allows me to maintain the level of posture that I want, and to be efficient in the use of my budget. I think it's really important. We can't secure everything all of the time. We can try, it depends on how much money we've got, right? But we've got to put targeted approaches in to deal with the things that are really important to get us to an acceptable level of risk. We're never going to get to zero. We need to understand what our acceptable level is and to be able to manage down to that. And I really want it to, I'm not sure we're there with all the tools yet, but to be able to not just quantify, what's the likelihood of breach, but actually to have some form of measure of how well am I able to recover if it does go all horribly wrong? And I think that's the next challenge for a lot of CRQ tools, is looking at that, am I actually able to recover if I end up with a MERS-style scenario?
No, thank you. I actually have an example that I could share in my previous role. One of my customers back then was hit by a ransomware attack, as Daniel, you say. It's so prevalent right now in two of their manufacturing facilities in Eastern Europe, and we had built a CRQ model for them, and they sort of within 48 hours they had a slide deck in front of the senior management which said, we were hit. This is how we were hit. This is what the inherent risk was, but this is all the good stuff we've done in trying to increase our cyber resilience. So this is the residual impact of it. So and this wasn't the team that actually built the model, and sort of it was the business that engaged used the model to sort of come up with this. So CRQ was actually embedded in the organization, which is refreshing to see. It's being used by the business to sort of convert or sort of pivot a negative scenario into a bit more positive messaging in that instance. But obviously, as you say, with something like a Balbix or something, you can increase the effectiveness of that to 100x, I think. Yeah. So last question before we sort of hand back to Samir. Where do we go next in CRQ then from here?
Should I go first?
Sure.
Yeah, I think so. I think the next stuff is partly what I've already mentioned in terms of how do we come to be able to quantify what the impact is? How do we start to model what the real impact is? Which comes back to one of your earlier questions around, how do we get fidelity in those figures? Because how much will it cost us to recover? Can we recover? Are our backups working? Are they going to bring us back online? Do we really have a handle on this? As well as a lot of protect. And then I think you get into some really cool stuff about how do you use it and how do you use it for predictive. So I think there's some use cases that are quite interesting. So often, I don't know how many people on this call suffer from this problem, and maybe they do, maybe they don't. But software developers, we're in a hurry to get our features out. We definitely want to go live, and so we've just gone through our static code testing, maybe even some dynamic code testing, and we've got a shed load of tech debt. And what often happens, I see, is but we've got to go live, so we'll fix that in production. We'll take a call, we'll risk accept this, and fix that in production. What I'd like to see is the ability to use CRQ models to go, okay, that's fine, you want to go and fix this in production. Let's take all the vulnerabilities that we've identified in our static and dynamic code testing and see where you want to introduce them into our lovely environment and see how that's going to change our risk. And so we've agreed on that, we've got a model that works, we're happy with the numbers, and then we predict. So we put new vulnerabilities into that environment and say, how does that change my risk exposure? Oh, I've just added 500 million worth of risk exposure. Do you still want to go live with that app and fix it in production? Or do you think we might want to fix it first before we go live? It's that sort of, let's allow some real decision making around how fast we want to go and how much tech debt we're prepared to input into the environment. So I think developing those capabilities is definitely where we need to go.
Maybe also from my point of view, it's also helping us in the awareness, I would say. So as soon as we have something to share, kind of an indicator or whatever it is at the end towards the business, towards the non-IT specialists or whatever, it helps us. And cyber risk quantification is certainly something which does a great job. This is at least what I can also recognize in our company. So as said, we are still on the journey. So the monetary part is not yet fully implemented. But if you talk about mean time to patch, I mean, internal audit is running around with these figures. And they're making aware the whole departments around the globe. And it's really getting something they're really getting better in doing these things. So it's also helping on that angle, apart from the things what Paul just said. So this is a very important part to also build up awareness on non-IT professionals, so to say. At least it helped us very much in our company in that sense.
Thank you. That's really useful. I think, Samir, I'll share that back with you. I believe you have some more questions that you'd like to ask the expert panel.
For sure. Thank you very much for the great insights that you shared. Last 45 minutes, 50 minutes, it was great to hear you, both of you great speakers. I believe my first question from auditorium is to you, the seat. What do you mean by term CRQ? Is it current risk or future risk? Maybe our attendees joined a little bit later, therefore it will be great if you can explain CRQ again.
Shall I go?
Yeah, go for it, Paul.
Yes, go for it.
Yeah, so it's a really good question, because what is risk? So risk is the likelihood of something happening in the future, isn't it? Really, it's an element of ultimately, when we talk about risk, really what we're talking about is the probability of something happening in the future. So the question is, in order to answer that question, is are we really talking about the likelihood of something happening in the future, or are we talking about the likelihood of something happening in the future based on our current state? And I think CRQ is, what is the likelihood of something bad happening based on our current position? Now, going back to what I was saying earlier about being able to use it as a predictive tool, what would be interesting actually is to be able to say, if the threat changes, what would that mean to our risk exposure? If I invest in these tools, what would that mean for my risk exposure? So there is an element of using a CRQ type platform to do what ifs in terms of how might things change. But fundamentally, what we're actually talking about is a tool that, if used in its current forms without putting in hypothetical situations, you're basically saying, based on the current threat, et cetera, this is my current risk exposure. I think that's pretty much what we're talking about. And even the FAIR type approach is based on, well, actually it's based on historic, really, because it's a sort of business like yours with controls like yours historically has faced these kinds of threats.
Thanks a lot, Paul, for the detailed answer. Great answer. Thanks a lot. And the next question, I believe, for both of you, have you ever had an opportunity to compare the financial impact estimated by CRQ to the cost of the real events?
Yes, I think that what you have to understand here is the outputs of CRQ are equivalent to risk-weighted assets. So what you're saying is, I have an exposure which is based on likelihood times impact. We're not saying that the impact of this type of event is going to cost you this. So that's why I think the shape of the curve is more interesting. The actual figure is interesting, but I don't think in any of these particular models, you're actually saying that the impact associated with this particular event is what you're explaining as the risk exposure. You're trying to explain exposure in a financial model, which is akin to what's my exposure to credit risk? How many people are actually going to pay back their loans when I model my exposure to credit risk, or when I model my exposure to market risk? We're talking about risk exposure. We're not talking about the impact of this is going to be this number, because the impact of that, by definition, will be bigger than that number, because it's likelihood times impact.
Great, thanks a lot. Daniel, would you like to add something, or shall I go to the next question?
Well, it's a simple answer, no, because we are still on our journey, yeah? So.
That's absolutely true. Thanks a lot. We have very interesting view here, and our attendee would like to get your view on it as well. Under the lately experience in a global war, a possible event to be taken into consideration during the risk management and the quantification of these risks. Our attendee means that because this is not a clear and unsecure risk situation. What do you mean for this? What's
So
your...
I think that, do you want to have a go, Daniel, or shall I go?
Just go on.
Yeah, so that comes back to my point around threat intelligence. And there's two parts to this answer. One is it acceptable to do your cyber risk quantification once a year based on historic trends and go, oh, I think I'm here? Yeah, that doesn't take into account the changing nature of the threat situation. So I believe that you should have a cyber risk quantification approach that includes dynamic threat information. And so, you know, our threat intelligence around the rise of, you know, around about the time with the current crises, we know that Russian hackers were on the up and various organizations were targeted, and threat intelligence helped us understand and see those attacks building, or see the precursor activity. And in fact, I guess that's why MITRE has introduced that whole precursor element to attack, which helps you understand what's going on. So to the answer to the question, let me just check all that quick, the full, because I want to make sure I am answering. Oh, it's gone. Hang on. No, it's not. It's gone. Yes, my answer is it is possible, so long as you've got really good threat intelligence and that is incorporated in your model. Without it, it's not going to work.
Great, thanks a lot, Paul. Daniel, would you like to add something before we...
I mean, this terrible situation shows us how important it is, because it can change any time. So depending on what kind of things are exploited and stuff like that by either a group or whatever who is also fighting in the cyber war and so on. So therefore the static thing has passed. So you can't deal with it. So you need to have the threat intelligence in place. Is there known vulnerabilities, exploited vulnerabilities, or whatever kind of things? So and without knowing that one, you are helpless. So this is a really great example seen from a very bad background, that this is a must in these days, that you are able to act on such situation, whatever it is at the end. So you need to be able to act very fast, depending what actually is out there. So and without having, let's say, a help from a tool, artificial intelligence based tool or whatever, you're lost. I mean, Paul mentioned these 5 things that a human being is able to take care of potentially, but yeah, that's how I see it.
Great, thanks a lot, Daniel. And gentlemen, I believe your time management is as correct as your risk management. We are exact on time. Thanks also for great insights that you shared with our attendees today, and we had a great interest in the event. I just give the ball to Sid for the last closing words, and then we will say goodbye to our attendees.
Yeah, thank you, Samir. Now, thank you everybody for taking the time out to attend to us, and especially thank you to Daniel and Paul for the expert insights. As we mentioned, Balbix is a cybersecurity automation platform, and if you want to find out more about how we approach CRQ with all the things that have been discussed today, do get in touch with us. So thank you very much for your time.
Well, thanks, Sid, thanks, Paul and Daniel, and hope to see you again in Zurich. Have a nice evening and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.